In the 1890s, as the Scramble and partition of Africa was taking place, there was a rumor that Germany was interested in Uganda. When the British heard about this, they had to make a move quickly. You see, Britain already had Egypt because they wanted to control the Suez Canal. And to control Egypt, you need to also control the source of the Nile. By this time, the source of the Nile had already been established, and so the scramble for Uganda began. The British Parliament debated extensively on this issue, whether building a railway would cement their presence in East Africa. Some of the parliamentarians felt that this was a waste of time and resources, and they named this railway the Lunatic Express. This was going to be costly for the British taxpayer, and there was no guarantee it would be successful. The bill, known as Uganda Railway Act of 1896, authorized the construction of the railway. The man tasked with this was George Whitehouse, an experienced civil engineer who had spent most of his time working across the British Empire. Whitehouse was the chief engineer between 1895 and 1903 and also served as the railway's manager from its opening in 1901. In order to get to Uganda, a big part of the railway line would be built in Kenya. The British were not really interested in Kenya. It was a conduit for transporting Uganda's vast resources to the port of Mombasa. Construction began in 1896 in Mombasa and was completed in 1901 in Kisumu, at the time known as Port Florence. To the indigenous communities in East Africa, the railway line was referred as the Iron Snake in our local dialects. This name is associated with ancient prophecies attributed to the Maasai, Kikuyu, Kamba, and Kalenjin tribes of Kenya. The local population knew that the Iron Snake would one day cross their land, and this would be a bad omen. Among the Agikuyu people, Prophet Mugo wa Kibiru prophesied the coming of the white people years before they arrived at the coast. Masaku, a Kamba sage and chief, together with Mwende Moya, a seer from Embu, both saw a black snake coming and all the cattle disappearing, stolen from their communities by the red people. This is how they would refer to white people, probably because of the effects of walking around in the hot scorching sun. Most of the workers involved in the construction came from India, since the British had earlier on established themselves in this region. So why didn't they recruit from Kenya's indigenous communities? Well, I think most communities were already against construction of the railway through their lands, and without this cooperation, not much could be achieved. Additionally, the British would have put in more resources in training, since this type of construction required skilled labor. Some history books also state that in the late 1890s, the population living in the area that is now Kenya had significantly declined because of famine, drought, wars, and smallpox. 3 years of drought in the mid-1890s, followed by a decade of below average rainfall, caused even Lake Naivasha to completely dry up. The Maasai were able to herd their cattle straight across the lake bed. Ultimately, there were very few able-bodied men willing and available to work on the railway. A decision was then made to recruit artisans and coolies from India. The British then reached out to none other than Alibai Mullah Jivanjee, who had previous experience in successfully recruiting workers for the Imperial British East Africa Company. Jivanjee went on to become one of the wealthiest men in East Africa in the early 1900s. He also started the East African Standard, a popular newspaper in the region, which he later sold for 50 sterling pounds. In 1906, Jivanjee began construction of a garden in the middle of Nairobi CBD, which was later named Jivanjee Gardens. In Karachi, Jivanjee was responsible for recruiting the railway workers, known by the socially negative and racist term coolies. Workers were sourced from villages in Punjab and sent to Karachi. Just after recruitment began, a plague broke out in India and delayed the building of the railway. A quarantine camp had to be set up at Budapur, financed by the Uganda Railway, where recruits would spend 14 days in quarantine before departure. A total of 35,729 coolies were recruited, together with 1,082 subordinate officers. Each coolie signed a contract for 3 years at 12 rupees per month. They would also get free food, and a return passage to the place where they were enlisted. They received half pay when in hospital and free medical attendance. By the time of completion, 6,500 had been wounded by indigenous communities and animals. 2,500 had died, mainly from disease. Many of the laborers returned to India, but 6,724 decided to remain, creating a community of Indian East Africans. So how was it working on the railway? The construction took place through what was known as the Nyika, the waterless and virtually uninhabited Taru Desert, which is over 90 kilometers inland from Mombasa. Earthworks were shaped laboriously by hand, using picks and shovels. All drinking water had to be transported from the coast to the tented camps set up by the workers. In November 1896, 22 days of heavy rain caused a severe outbreak of malaria, which then delayed the work. Every member of the European staff and over 50,000 of the Indian workforce suffered from malaria at one point or another. To make this worse, jiggers, the little insects which bore under the skin and lay a sack of eggs, causing intense irritation, became a serious menace. Working on the railway was also plagued by drought, disease, and other problems. In Savo, the camp was terrorized by a pair of man-eating lions that slaughtered 28 workers before being hunted down and killed. Some accounts estimate this number to be as high as 35. We shall talk about this in detail on the next episode. The tsetse fly was another dreaded menace, through which the workers contracted sleeping sickness. Kenya's indigenous population made it very complicated and dangerous for the British to advance their project. A major incident was the Kedong massacre, when the Maasai attacked a railway workers' caravan, killing 500 people. Prior to this, 2 Maasai girls had been raped. An Englishman known as Andrew Dick, who at the time was not part of the railway entourage, led a counter-attack. He ran out of ammunition and was speared to death by the Maasai. As the railway line approached western Kenya, the Nandi people, led by Koitalel Arap Samoei, caused a lot of disturbance, and for a while, construction stopped. Later on, Koitalel was killed by Richard Mainatzagen in 1905. During construction, transportation was needed to carry heavy loads from the railhead to the forward construction sites. Tsetse flies, however, wreaked havoc with the animal transport on which the construction relied on. Between 1897 and 1898, most of the bullocks, mules, and horses died of sleeping sickness, which is caused by the tsetse flies. The area of land that was most affected stretched from Mazeras to Kibwezi. Additional horses brought into the country succumbed to the same fate within 2 months of their arrival. After this, animal transport was abandoned and human porterage organized to shoulder as a temporary but very expensive solution. Most books on this topic are written from a perspective of the British. They seem to be inclined towards the notion that the main purpose for building the railway was to bring economic and social development to this part of the world. I would like to disagree on this. The main reason the railway was built was to further the interest of Britain as a country and as an imperialist nation that was hell-bent on taking over the world. These books talk about how the railway built the economy of the region by facilitating the opportunities for trade and export. The issue here is all the revenue was sent back to England. Not much was done for the indigenous population. To add salt to injury, the imperial government encouraged the British public to settle in Kenya as plantation owners. For this to happen, Africans were pushed to reserves and their prime land allocated to foreign settlers. These settlers were encouraged to grow cash crops such as coffee and tea, which were then transported out of East Africa for processing and sale in Europe. As more Europeans came into the country, more Africans became alienated from their lands, and as this happened, the settlers were concerned about maintaining an adequate supply of African labor. Very few Africans voluntarily agreed to work on the farms, and so settlers asked the colonial government to roll out measures that would compel the Africans to offer their services. This resulted in the introduction of the hut tax, where each hut used as a dwelling place was required to pay 1 rupee annually. Those who were unable to meet their tax obligations were forced to offer their labor in building roads and other construction projects. This forced Africans to work on European farms so that they can raise money to pay as taxes. To make matters worse, The introduction of the Kipande system made sure that the colonial government kept track of supply of labor and enforcement of contracts. If an employee absconded, government agents would easily return them as their previous employers were contained in the Kipande. Since most Kenyans were unable to read, it made it impossible to negotiate a better pay with a prospective employer. The Kipande contained details of previous wages. This enabled the colonial government to standardize wages for Africans. Kipande brought misery to Africans, especially if it somehow got lost. They would live in misery until they were able to replace it. In contrast with most indigenous leaders within East Africa, Egyptian ruler Abbas I and Emperor Menelik of Ethiopia wanted to have railway lines built in their countries, so they were not opposed to it in any way. In fact, Abbas is the one who masterminded the first railway on the African continent. He wanted to speed up industrialization in Egypt and bring it to the same level as Europe. The Kenya-Uganda Railway, however, was created so that Britain could better fight its opponents in colonialism. Furthermore, it was easier to impose the same set of laws and regulations in vast areas that were connected by the railway. The railway line from Lagos to Kano in Nigeria brought together two vast areas with two completely different religions. Most of the cities and towns in Kenya sprang up as a result of the railway, most notably Nairobi. The once poor outpost on a swamp became a very integral part of the Kenya-Uganda Railway. Water from the swamps in Nairobi was used to operate steam locomotives. Before the construction of the railway, the Maasai grazed their livestock on this plain. They named it Enkare Nairobi, meaning a place of cool waters. The Maasai nearest neighbors were the Kikuyu, who tilled the fertile land in the forest clearings but rarely ventured into the plains. Nairobi originated by chance because railway workers in 1899 chose the level site for planning and organizing their next task, which was laying down a track on the face of the Rift Valley escarpment some 32 kilometers to the north. Before long, workshops and dukas sprang up. A large tented encampment to house the railway workers also came up. Since the railway legally owned land 1 kilometer on either side of the tracks, they were responsible for the planning and development in regards to constructions that sprang up. However, the place soon became a struggling, haphazard and ugly collection of tin shanties. The railway authorities ignored this because Nairobi was never meant to be a permanent base. Between 1903 and 1906, the colonial government was seriously considering abandoning the location in favor of Kikuyu Township, but it seemed too late. Nairobi grew and grew. In 1902, the bubonic plague broke out at the Indian Bazaar in Nairobi, causing 19 deaths out of 63 recorded cases. Dr. Alfred Spurrier, a government medical officer at the time, ordered the entire area torched to the ground. Rats had increased in numbers in the filth that had accumulated in a small area of the bazaar. In 1906, the bazaar was moved to its present location on Biashara Street. From Nairobi, the railway expanded to other parts of Kenya and then to Eldoret, to Kampala, eliminating the need to use ships on Lake Victoria. On reaching Nakuru, it was a pristine wilderness. The area was then set up to be an engine changing station and a divisional headquarters. It even had a customs post for clearing goods entering Uganda up until 1902, when the border between Uganda and the East African Protectorate was changed. In 1904, Nakuru was declared a township. Additional lines were built from Nakuru to Nyahururu, Nakuru to Rongai, and from Konza to Magadi. During World War II, Italy invaded Ethiopia, forcing the British to build another railway line from Nairobi to Nanyuki. They specifically used this line to supply their forces, who were in the north of the colony defending the border. The plan was to continue building all the way, but when the British troops defeated the Italians, construction stopped at Nanyuki. Once the Uganda Railway was completed, the question as to how it would pay for itself arose. Sir Charles Elliot decided that the only way to do this was to promote white settlement. These settlers aspired to turn the vast fertile land of Kenya into a white man's paradise. This went on to have a negative impact on the indigenous population already occupying these lands. As for the indigenous communities, It wasn't until 1920 that the railway became a medium of mass transport for them. Up until that time, Kenyans had avoided riding the railway and only did so when their fares were paid by their employers. They preferred to walk along the railway lines, sometimes for hundreds of kilometers. The reason for doing this, well, expensive fares and the deplorable conditions of the third-class coaches. There is evidence that many East Africans actually feared traveling on the train. Later on, when railway transport became more common to Kenyans, it still retained that colonial aura. The railway was strongly associated with crimes of colonial conquest. Harry Thuku was quoted saying, "Our land was never won by conquest, by the force of arms, nor even by peaceful penetration. It was the railroad that took away a big chunk of our homeland. Little did we dream that the innocent-looking trains of the railway would rob us of the very existence and drive us from our homelands." Preferential treatment was given to European passengers, cementing the fact that the railway's purpose was to serve the interest of the white settlers only. The railway amplifies the racial, economic, and political inequalities of the colony. I was going through this report titled Ruin of Empire, and the author mentioned real-life experiences of Kenyans traveling on trains. Pamenas Githendu from Murang'a got into a train in 1931 and was told that Africans were traveling second class and were not allowed to use the dining car, which was reserved for Europeans. The steward informed him that Africans had to eat their meals in their carriage. This is what Githendu said in that report. "It was very late when they brought the supper, and when I tasted the soup, it made me feel sick, as it was very cold, being what was left after the Europeans had served. And afterwards, I could not fall asleep because I felt hungry, for although I had paid for the supper, I did not eat it." This perception changed when the railway began employing many Kenyans. Over time, it became an integral part of urban life in Kenya. By 1955, the East African Railways and Harbors Corporation became the single largest employer in the country, employing more than 56,000 permanent African staff. Working with the railway was considered prestigious, as the job offered a stable income and it came with certain perks, workers' housing, which was some of the best in Nairobi. This story is not complete without the mention of Nubians and the role they played as guards during construction of the railway. In 1883, Equatoria, a province of Sudan, was cut off from the rest of the country during the Mahdist Rebellion. The governor of Equatoria, Emin Pasha, and his troops survived in complete isolation for 5 years, solidifying their sense of unity and community. In 1890, Captain Frederick Lugard of the Imperial British East Africa Company sought out a group of soldiers from Emin Pasha's forces who were at the time under the command of Selim Bey. Since they were no longer needed in the Egyptian-Sudan War, Lugard made an offer to incorporate them in Ibea, which later became Kenya and Uganda. The troops, together with their dependents numbering approximately 10,000, became very important in enforcing the colonialist grip on East Africa. In 1897, the Nubian soldiers protested their low and irregular pay. In addition, their living conditions was not really good, and they were also separated from their families for long periods of time. The revolt cemented the fact that the British colonial administration was highly dependent on this army. After completion of the railway in 1902, the Ugandan Rifles and East African Rifles were combined together with the Central Africa Regiment to form the King's African Rifles, KAR, and recognized as troops of the Queen of England. In 1904, dependents of the Nubian soldiers began to settle throughout Kenya and Uganda. In Kenya, their biggest settlement was at Kibra. Kibra in Kinubi means forest. In 1918, Kibra was gazetted as a military reserve by the colonial government. Former soldiers who had served more than 12 years, together with their dependents, were given permission to live on a plot in the area. They were allowed to build structures, graze a limited amount of cattle, grow food once they are issued a shamba pass by the military. After independence in 1960s, railways and port operations in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania were administered by a single entity, the East African Railways and Harbors. The disbanding of the East African Community in 1977 marked the beginning of the end for the railway system. Each of the three countries went ahead to run its own railway independently. Kenya decided to split railway and port operations into two state-owned corporations, that is the Kenya Railways and the Kenya Ports Authority. At this time, this seemed like a good move, but it ultimately resulted in the Kenya Railways being starved of funding.